My name is Daniel. I'm 20 years old, and most days of my life begin with the same small rituals, habits that keep the silence at bay. The first is coffee. Always coffee. The sharp hiss of the machine breaking the morning stillness, the rich smell filling my tiny kitchen like a promise of warmth. I stand there, barefoot against cold tiles, waiting for that first pour into a chipped mug I've carried since college. It tastes the same every morning, slightly bitter, slightly comforting, and for a few minutes, I let myself believe that routine is enough. After coffee, there's the sound of tools. My garage is small, crowded with coils of cables, worn-out screwdrivers, and half-empty toolboxes. I'm a field technician, Wi-Fi installations, repairs, troubleshooting. Some people see it as ordinary work, but for me, there's something quiet about it, something almost meditative. Wires and routers don't argue. They don't hide secrets. They either connect or they don't. I like that honesty. By the time the city outside wakes up, I'm already pacing my apartment, laptop open on the table, the glow of the screen casting long shadows across the floor. I check my assignments, log the calls, trace the day's routes. There's a kind of rhythm to it, addresses, numbers, signals. Lives I'll step into for an hour at a time, then leave without a trace. And then, silence. The kind that seeps in when the hum of the machine stops, and the footsteps fade. The kind that makes you suddenly aware of how small your apartment feels, how the clock ticks louder when you're the only one listening. I tell myself I don't mind it. That being invisible in the crowd of the city is a kind of freedom. But there are nights, late ones, when the glow of the laptop is the only light in the room, and I wonder if maybe I've let myself become too comfortable with being alone. I'm not unhappy. At least, that's what I tell people when they ask. I work, I eat, I sleep, and I wake up to do it all again. It's predictable. Safe. But safety has a way of dulling the edges of life, of making days blur into one another until you can't quite remember when anything last felt different. That morning, I moved through the same motions, the coffee, the garage, the laptop. The same silence pressing against me like a familiar weight. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that the course of my day, and maybe my life, was about to shift. Because storms don't announce themselves. They don't send warnings before they break into your silence. Sometimes, they arrive in the form of a single repair ticket, typed in hurried words on a screen. And sometimes, they arrive as a knock on the door you weren't expecting to open. It was late afternoon when the silence was broken. My laptop screen flickered with a new assignment, the text simple, almost forgettable, urgent repair request. Apartment on Riverstone Avenue. Evening preferred. At first, I almost dismissed it, just another job, another router gone silent. But then I noticed the note attached, a sentence typed quickly, as if the person didn't have the strength to think it through. Please, if possible, tonight. The silence is unbearable. The words stayed with me. They pressed against something I recognized too well, the weight of emptiness when no one else is around. I packed my tools, slid on my jacket, and stepped out into the fading light. The building stood old but dignified, brick walls dulled by years of weather, windows reflecting the last gold of the sun. My footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway, the smell of dust and faint perfume lingering in the air. Apartment 3B. I knocked once, the sound carrying down the quiet corridor. There was a pause. Then the soft shuffle of feet on the other side. When the door opened, I found myself looking into the eyes of someone who seemed both present and far away. Her name was Clara. 26. She had the kind of tired eyes that tell you she hasn't been sleeping much, framed by loose strands of hair she hadn't bothered to tame. She apologized before I even spoke, her voice low and unsteady. Sorry for the mess. I wasn't expecting company. She stepped aside to let me in. The apartment was dim, lit only by the orange spill of evening through the curtains. Lavender candles burned on the shelf, their scent fighting against something heavier, something like dust, like unopened windows, like the air hadn't moved in weeks. Clara moved with a kind of hesitation, as though every gesture carried weight. She offered me water, then changed her mind, then set the glass down untouched. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. She was trying to appear fine, but the silence between her words said otherwise. As I unpacked my tools and knelt by the router, I felt her presence in the doorway behind me. Not intrusive, but lingering, like she didn't want to be alone in the room, but didn't know how to ask for company. "Does this happen often?" she asked, her tone almost apologetic. "Routers breaking?" I glanced back with a small smile. "Every day." She shook her head, eyes lowering. "No, I meant, this kind of silence. Like it's louder than it should be." The question hung in the air. I didn't answer right away, because I understood too well what she meant. That was the moment I realized she hadn't called for Wi-Fi. Not really. She'd called because she needed someone, anyone, to step into her silence. And somehow, without meaning to, I had. The router sat in front of me, its small green light blinking stubbornly, half alive. My hands moved through the motions, untangling wires, resetting connections, things I'd done 100 times before. But this time felt different, because I wasn't alone in the silence. Clara lingered near the kitchen counter, pretending to busy herself with small tasks. She wiped down the same corner twice, rearranged a stack of unopened mail, picked up her mug, set it down again. I could see her fingers trembling slightly, like she was holding something inside she couldn't let spill out. "Do you want coffee?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the air like a fragile note. I looked up, caught off guard. "Sure, if it's not too much trouble." She nodded quickly, almost relieved to have something to do. The smell of fresh coffee soon drifted through the apartment, richer than the faint lavender that had greeted me earlier. The kettle hissed, the mugs clinked softly, and for a moment, I let myself watch her. The way her shoulders curved inward, as if she was trying to take up less space. The way her eyes flickered toward me, then away, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to be seen. When she set the mug beside me, her hand brushed the table lightly, and I noticed the faintest tremor in her fingers. She pulled back quickly, as though she hadn't meant to reveal anything. "Thank you," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. She nodded, wrapping her own hands around her cup as if holding on for warmth. We sat like that for a while, me working on wires, her sipping coffee in the doorway. The silence should have been heavy, but it wasn't. It felt suspended. Like both of us were waiting for something we couldn't name. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever get tired of this? Fixing other people's problems all day?" I glanced at her, surprised by the question. "Sometimes. But I guess it feels good to know I can make things work again. Even if it's just cables and signals." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "That must be nice. Fixing things." There was a weight behind her words, something unspoken. My eyes lingered on her longer than I meant to, searching for what she wasn't saying. The router finally blinked steady, its light glowing constant and strong. I sat back, exhaling. "It's fixed." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't the connection that mattered. Clara looked at the router, then at me. She held my gaze a moment too long, her eyes soft, almost pleading. And in that fragile silence between us, I felt something shift. Not because of the Wi-Fi. Not because of the coffee. But because two people, strangers only an hour ago, had chosen to share the same quiet, and found it wasn't unbearable anymore. It could have ended that night. I could have packed my tools, thanked her for the coffee, and walked out into the evening like I had from countless other apartments. But somehow it didn't. A few days later, another ticket appeared. Same building. Same apartment. Same name. This time, the note simply read, "It's acting up again." When I arrived, the router was working perfectly. Clara shrugged, almost embarrassed, her cheeks warming. "Maybe I pressed the wrong button," she said, though we both knew that wasn't true. Still, I stayed, and she brewed another pot of coffee. That became the pattern. Once, then again, then more often. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, that the equipment was just sensitive, that she really did need help. But eventually, I stopped asking questions. And she stopped pretending. We began talking more. At first, small things, favorite movies, the best late-night food in town, the quirks of neighbors we'd both noticed. But slowly, the conversations deepened. She told me she used to paint but hadn't touched a brush in years. That she once planned to move abroad but never bought the ticket. She laughed about the silly things, like burning rice 3 times in 1 week, but her eyes dimmed when she mentioned the silence after her ex left. I found myself sharing too, pieces I usually kept hidden. Stories of long nights working in empty apartments, of how routine had become my shield against loneliness. I admitted that sometimes, when I fixed people's Wi-Fi, I envied the voices and laughter spilling from their rooms once I left. Our silences changed too. They were no longer heavy, no longer reminders of distance. They became softer, almost sacred, moments where words weren't needed. She'd sit by the window, legs tucked under her, sketching absent-mindedly while I nursed a coffee. I'd glance up from a cable or tool and find her watching me, her gaze lingering just a second too long. One evening, rain pattered against the window, steady and rhythmic. We sat on the floor, mugs in hand, the router humming quietly beside us. Clara leaned back, her voice almost a whisper. "Do you ever feel like life's moving on without you?" I nodded slowly. "Every day." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "I thought I was the only one." It struck me then, how rare it was to find someone who not only listened, but understood the pauses between your words. How fragile it felt, this bond forming quietly in the corner of her dim apartment. We didn't call it anything. We didn't label it. But with each visit, with each shared silence and story, it became clearer. Something rare was taking root. Not dramatic. Not rushed. Just human. And in that quiet unfolding, I realized the Wi-Fi wasn't the only thing keeping me connected here. It was a Tuesday evening when the first shadow appeared. I had just finished adjusting a cable by her desk when a phone buzzed against the counter. Clara's eyes flicked toward it, then quickly away. But I noticed the way her hands froze, the way her shoulders tensed. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't erased. Ethan. She silenced it without a word, but the air in the room changed. I didn't ask. Not then. But as we sat with our coffee, her gaze drifted toward the window, her expression caught somewhere between guilt and exhaustion. Finally she spoke. "He still calls sometimes. My ex. We ended things months ago, but he doesn't believe endings should stay that way." Her voice cracked on the last word. I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that she didn't owe anyone explanations. But the truth pressed heavy in my chest. Because I wasn't sure where I fit into her story either. Was I just the quiet presence filling a space he left behind? Was I the silence she needed to forget, or something she might want to keep? The following week, the weight grew heavier. My sister called one evening, asking where I'd been spending my time. I dodged her questions, but she laughed knowingly. "You've been quieter than usual. You're hiding something, Daniel." And she wasn't wrong. I hadn't told anyone about Clara. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't know how to explain something so fragile without breaking it. The conflict sat inside me like a stone. Each time I walked down the hallway toward her door, my steps carried both anticipation and fear. What if her family found out? What if my friends asked too many questions? What if this was nothing more than a temporary escape for her, a way to silence the ghosts of her past, until she no longer needed me? One night, as rain hammered against the window, the tension finally surfaced. I was packing up my tools when she asked quietly, "Do people ever misunderstand you? For being the way you are?" I looked at her uncertain. "What do you mean?" She held her mug tighter, eyes lowered. "You're kind. But distant. Like you want to be close, but you're afraid of what happens if you are." Her words cut deeper than I expected. Because she was right. I wanted this connection, more than I dared admit. But wanting it meant risking the silence I had grown so used to, risking rejection, risking the judgment of people who would never understand how something so small, a shared coffee, a fixed router, could mean so much. I met her eyes, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The storm outside filled the room with its steady roar. And I realized that the real storm wasn't out there, it was inside us. A fragile bond, now tested by shadows neither of us had asked for. The night it finally happened, the apartment felt heavier than usual. The router hummed quietly in the corner, but it wasn't the signal that mattered anymore. It was the silence, dense, unyielding, filled with everything we had been circling around but hadn't dared to name. Clara sat across from me at the small wooden table, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. The candle between us flickered, casting shadows across her face. I could see the storm in her eyes, the kind that builds quietly until it has no choice but to break. She tried to smile, to keep things light, but her voice faltered. "Do you ever wonder how long this can last? Us sitting here like this, pretending it's nothing more?" My chest tightened. I set my tools aside, the sound of the zipper breaking the silence like a warning shot. I searched for words, but they stuck in my throat. Because the truth was, I had been wondering. Every day. Every visit. Her hands trembled as she reached for the candle, steadying it. Then, with a breath that sounded almost like surrender, she whispered, "I can't pretend anymore." The words hung in the air, sharp and fragile. I felt them sink into me, deeper than any confession I had heard before. I looked at her, really looked, at the fear in her shoulders, the vulnerability etched into her trembling hands, the way her eyes refused to let go of mine even though it terrified her. And something inside me broke too, the wall I had been holding for so long. "Neither can I," I said quietly, the words heavier than I expected. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that doesn't suffocate, but waits. Holds its breath. Clara's hand slid across the table, hesitant, searching. My own reached out before I could think, our fingers meeting in the space between us. Her skin was warm, trembling, but real. Her voice cracked, raw and small. "I was afraid you'd leave. That you'd fix what was broken and walk out like everyone else." I swallowed hard, my thumb brushing against her knuckles. "I was afraid too. That I'd stay, and it wouldn't be enough." The candle flickered again, as if listening. Outside, the city moved on, cars passing, rain dripping from rooftops. But in that room, time felt suspended. The silence after our words said more than anything else could. It said we were both tired of hiding, both terrified of what this meant, but unwilling to let it go. For the first time, the silence wasn't unbearable. It was alive, with truth, with fear, with the fragile beginnings of something real. And in that trembling moment, holding her hand across the table, I realized there was no turning back. The confession lingered between us long after the words had been spoken. The silence was no longer empty, it was full, heavy, alive. Our hands remained joined across the table, fingers trembling but unwilling to let go. For a long while, we simply breathed together, as if relearning how to exist in the same space without hiding. Finally, Clara stood, tugging me gently toward the window. The city stretched out below us, lights scattered like stars fallen to earth. Rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening, every surface shimmering under the street lamps. "Come on," she whispered, her voice steadier now. "I don't want to sit still anymore." We stepped outside into the night, the air cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet pavement and distant blossoms. The world felt hushed, as if it, too, was waiting to see what would happen next. We walked side by side, our shoulders brushing occasionally, either of us pulling away. At one corner, she laughed softly, the sound unpracticed but genuine. I turned to look, and in her smile I saw something fragile, like hope beginning to take shape after being buried for too long. At a quiet stretch of street, we stopped. Her gaze lifted to mine, uncertain but unafraid. The pause was everything. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of us standing beneath the hum of a streetlight, hearts unshielded. I leaned closer, not rushing, just enough to ask without words. She closed the space with a soft, careful kiss, hesitant at first, then grounding, steady. It wasn't the kind of kiss you see in movies, desperate and sweeping. It was gentler, as if we both knew how easily it could break. A promise whispered rather than shouted, When we pulled apart, her forehead rested against mine. She exhaled shakily, then whispered, "You stayed." And I realized how much that mattered. More than fixing her Wi-Fi. More than filling her silence. What mattered was that, in a world where people walked away too quickly, I hadn't. We didn't speak much after that. We didn't need to. We just kept walking, two silhouettes under the glow of streetlights, steps falling into rhythm. There was no grand declaration, no certainty about what tomorrow would hold. But there was something even more valuable: possibility. The kind that doesn't shout or demand, but settles quietly in your chest, telling you that maybe, just maybe, this is the start of something worth holding on to. When we finally returned to her building, she paused at the door, her hand lingering on mine. Her eyes, tired but softer now, met mine with a quiet strength. "This doesn't have to be the end," she said. And I knew she was right. It wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something new.